The choice. The wind in the high passes cut like a blade, carrying the smell of snow and smoke. Cale Rin kept his eyes down, one boot in front of the other, careful not to slip on the icy ledge. The chest strapped to his back was heavy, but not with coin alone. This was the tribute to the mountain's dragons. Every year, the strongest apprentice from the valley smithy was sent to deliver the gold. This year, the lot had fallen to Cale. It wasn't supposed to be dangerous. The truce between dragon and man had held for 3 generations, but everyone knew the truth. The dragons allowed peace because they had no reason to burn the villages, yet. The path opened onto a wide, flat shelf of rock. Above, jagged peaks clawed at the gray sky. And in the center, the roost. They were already waiting. Dragons, 6 of them, their scales catching dull light. Smoke curled from their nostrils, and the heat rolling off their bodies turned the snow to hissing steam. Cale swallowed hard and walked forward until the largest of them moved, unfolding wings that could have shadowed the whole square in his village. The matriarch, her eyes molten gold, studied him like she was weighing a tool for flaws. "You bring the tribute," she said, her voice like the crack of stone. Cale bowed and set the chest before her. "Gold from the valley." As agreed. Her gaze shifted past him to a smaller circle of dragons. In the center sat a hatchling, scales bronze and green, no bigger than a goat, but its eyes burned with the same molten hue. Before it lay 3 offerings, a heap of gold coins, a burning brazier, and 3 young dragons watching from a distance. Cale had heard of this, the choosing. Every hatchling was tested. Gold for wealth, flame for power, kin for loyalty to the clan. A dragon's choice shaped its place in their hierarchy. The hatchling approached the gold first, sniffing the coins before snorting and moving on. It lingered by the brazier, staring into the fire. The matriarch lowered her head, expectant. But then the hatchling turned and looked straight at Cale. The little dragon padded forward, talons clicking on stone, until it stood a breath away. It sniffed his boots, his hands, then pressed its warm body against his legs with a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr. The entire roost stilled. "That is not an option," the matriarch said coldly. "Step back, hatchling." It didn't move. Cale's mouth was dry. "I think it likes me." "It does not like," the matriarch snapped. "It chooses. You are not gold. You are not flame. You are not kin." The hatchling growled, low and defiant. One of the other dragons hissed, wings flaring. Cale stepped back instinctively, but the hatchling followed, placing itself between him and the others. The matriarch's eyes narrowed. "You will leave it." "No." Cale bowed quickly, heart hammering. "Of course." He turned and walked toward the trail, feeling the heat of many eyes on his back. At the bend, he glanced over his shoulder. The hatchling still stood there, staring after him. That night, Cale camped halfway down the mountain, too tired to reach the village. He set a small fire, ate cold bread, and tried not to think about the strange look in the hatchling's eyes. A twig snapped behind him. Cale spun, hand on his knife, and froze. The hatchling stepped into the firelight, head low, eyes bright. It had followed him. "You shouldn't be here," Cale whispered. "They'll come for you." The hatchling chirped softly and sat, curling its tail around its feet. Cale hesitated. If the dragons found it with him, the truce could shatter. The smart thing would be to drive it away. But as he looked into those molten eyes, he saw no threat, only trust. "You stubborn little thing," he murmured. "Fine. But if you're coming with me, you need a name." He thought of the brazier's glow, the warmth against his legs. "Ember," he said. The hatchling's head tilted, as if trying the word on for size. Then it padded closer and lay down beside him, scales warm as a forged stone. Cale stared into the fire, wondering what trouble he'd just invited into his life. High above, unseen in the darkness, a pair of golden eyes watched the camp, and turned away without a sound. Sparks in the forge. The forge was no place for a dragon hatchling. At least, that's what Cale kept telling himself as he tried to hammer a stubborn piece of steel while Ember, still small enough to fit across his workbench, watched with an unblinking gaze. Her tail draped lazily off the edge, flicking with each strike of the hammer. Every so often she would let out a low rumble, as if commenting on his technique. "You know," Kale muttered, "most apprentices at least pretend to be impressed." The dragon blinked, tilted her head, and let out a puff of smoke that curled toward the rafters. Kale tried to ignore how much warmer the forge felt with her around, warmth that wasn't entirely from the fire. The first weeks were chaos. Ember's curiosity knew no bounds, and her wings were clumsy in the tight space of the workshop. She knocked over buckets, singed the corner of Kale's work apron, and once tried to curl up inside the coal bin for a nap. Still, Kale found himself adjusting. He set aside a corner of the workshop just for her, layering it with blankets and soft leather scraps. He even shaped a shallow trough from hammered bronze to hold fresh water, though she seemed to prefer drinking straight from the rain barrel outside. At night, she slept near the forge, the low sound of her breathing mingling with the cooling crackle of embers. Kale had never been one for companionship. His tools didn't talk back, and his neighbors kept their distance. But now, the silence between hammer blows felt different. Warmer. Less empty. One afternoon, a heavy knock shook the forge door. When Kale opened it, he found himself staring at Rin, the village's unofficial troublemaker and self-appointed collector of interesting things. Rin's gaze slid past Kale to Ember. "Well now, that's unusual." Kale stepped into the doorway. "She's not for sale." "Didn't say she was," Rin said, grinning. "Just thought I'd warn you, there's talk in the square. Some folks don't like the idea of a dragon living this close." Kale's jaw tightened. "She's not hurting anyone." Rin shrugged. "Doesn't matter. People fear what they don't understand. Keep her close." That night, Kale found Ember staring into the forge fire, her reflection dancing on the molten coals. "They don't understand you," he said quietly. Her head turned, molten gold eyes locking with his. "Do you?" It startled him, not just that she'd spoken, but how certain her tone was. She'd spoken so little since he'd found her, and never with such directness. "I try," he admitted. Ember studied him for a long moment before curling back into her nest. "Then I will stay." Over the following days, Kale began to realize she wasn't just in his workshop, she was becoming part of it. She learned to keep her tail clear of the anvil, to fan the forge fire gently with her wings when the heat dipped, and to stay still while Kale shaped glowing metal. One morning, he woke to find her perched on the half-wall between the forge and his living quarters, head tilted toward a half-finished sword. When he picked it up to work on it, she rumbled softly. "What?" he asked. Her gaze shifted to the fuller, the groove running down the blade's center. She nudged it with her snout, then huffed. "You're saying it's too shallow?" Another rumble. Kale raised a brow. "You know, if you're going to critique my work, you could at least—" A sudden pop from the forge interrupted him. A spark had leapt toward his face, but before he could flinch, Ember's wings swept between him and the blast. The ember bounced harmlessly off her scales. They looked at each other, and Kale saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, something protective, fierce. By the end of the month, their rhythm was unshakable. Kale would work, Ember would watch, and between them, the forge felt alive in a way it never had before. One evening, as Kale banked the fire, he found himself speaking aloud without thinking. "If the day ever comes when someone tries to take you away, they'll have to go through me." Ember's eyes glimmered in the firelight. "They'll have to go through us." Kale didn't know it yet, but in that simple exchange, a bond had been forged, stronger than steel, fiercer than fire. A bond that neither dragonkind nor humankind would easily break. Fire on the mountain. Snow fell in soft, slow spirals as Kale hammered at the anvil, Ember's steady breath warming the forge from her corner. She had grown fast, her wingspan now longer than Kale was tall, her bronze-green scales deepening to a burnished sheen. That morning, the ground trembled before the first roar came. Kale froze, hammer in mid-swing. Outside, villagers were already spilling into the streets, pointing toward the mountains. Shapes moved against the clouds, vast, winged shadows descending. The dragons had returned. By the time Kale reached the square, the matriarch stood at its center. Steam rose from her nostrils as she surveyed the terrified crowd. Around her, 3 warriors flanked her in a half-circle. "You have something that belongs to us," she said, her voice cracking the air like a whip. Kale stepped forward before anyone else could. Ember chose to stay with me. That choice was folly, the matriarch growled. The hatchling will return to her kin now. Gold, flame, and blood, that is the way of dragons. You have no place in it. Behind her, one of the warriors shifted, revealing Ember standing just beyond the crowd. Her head was high, eyes fixed on the matriarch. The older dragon spread her wings wide. I will give her the choice once more. Gold. She tossed a heap of coins at Ember's feet. Flame. A nearby brazier flared under her breath. Kin. She gestured to the three warriors, their eyes hard with expectation. Ember didn't move toward any of them. Instead, she walked forward until she stood beside Kale, curling her tail protectively around him. This is my choice, Ember said in halting common, her voice raw but clear. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even Kale stared at her. She had never spoken more than a few words at a time. The matriarch's lips peeled back, revealing teeth like swords. Then you have chosen against your own blood. When she struck, it was without warning. A blast of fire erupted toward Kale, the heat searing the air. Ember lunged, wings folding around him like a shield. The flames rolled over her scales, leaving blackened streaks where the heat bit deepest. Kale coughed through the smoke, shoving at her side. Ember, move. The matriarch advanced. Stand aside, hatchling. He is prey. Prey dies. Kale's training hammer was still in his belt. Without thinking, he swung it, striking the matriarch's foreleg with a clang that rang across the square. It was like striking iron, but she recoiled, more in surprise than pain. Villagers began shouting, pelting the dragons with stones and arrows. A bucket of water crashed against the matriarch's side, sending up a cloud of steam. The three warriors stepped forward, but Ember roared, a deep, resonant sound that shook the snow from the rooftops. It wasn't the roar of a frightened hatchling. It was a challenge. The warriors froze. Even the matriarch's eyes widened. This human is my kin, Ember growled, switching to the dragon's own tongue. And any who harm him will face me. The standoff stretched, breath fogging in the cold air. The matriarch looked from Ember to Kale, then to the villagers holding their ground despite the obvious danger. Finally, she drew back, folding her wings. You risk much, hatchling. But perhaps there is strength in bonds not written in blood. Her voice was still hard, but no longer edged with imminent attack. She turned to Kale. You have the loyalty of one of ours. That makes you more dangerous than I expected. Without another word, she launched into the air. Her warriors followed, their wing beats echoing off the mountain walls until the sky swallowed them. The square was silent except for the hiss of cooling snow where fire had struck. Kale turned to Ember, who was still standing between him and the empty air where the matriarch had been. Blackened streaks marred her scales, but her eyes were bright and steady. You didn't have to take that blast for me, Kale said quietly. Yes, Ember replied simply. I did. She folded her wings, leaning into him for support. Around them, the villagers began to move again, some cautiously, some with newfound respect. But Kale hardly noticed. Because in that moment, it was clear to him that Ember's choice wasn't a mistake, wasn't folly. It was the kind of choice humans made every day. And now, a dragon had made it too. A new kind of treasure. The days after the confrontation passed in a strange quiet. The villagers went about their work, but Kale could feel the shift in the air. People who had once eyed Ember with suspicion now offered her scraps from their market stalls. Children who had hidden from her now peeked around corners, giggling when she snorted smoke in amusement. Kale spent most of his time tending her burns. Dragonhide was tough, but the matriarch's fire had left deep scorch marks that would take weeks to fully heal. Ember bore it without complaint, her eyes following him closely as he worked, as if memorizing his every movement. They'll come back, Kale said one night as he wrapped a fresh cloth over a charred patch of scales. Perhaps, Ember said. But I am ready. And so are you. Kale laughed without humor. I'm just a smith. You stood against a matriarch, she replied. And she stepped back. Winter storms rolled over the mountains in the weeks that followed, cutting the village off from the outside world. Kale and Ember patrolled the perimeter together, their breath steaming in the frozen air. The villagers began to trust that she wasn't just Kale's strange companion, she was a guardian. It was during one such patrol that Kale spotted the black specks against the gray sky. At first, he thought they were ravens, but the steady beat of wings and the way the air seemed to tremble told him otherwise. The dragons had returned. The matriarch landed at the edge of the village, snow exploding beneath her talons. But this time, there was no circle of warriors, only her and the older of the warriors from before. Kale stepped forward, Ember at his side. The matriarch studied them both for a long moment before speaking. "I have come to speak, not to fight." The villagers stayed back, but Kale could feel the tension ripple through them. "I'm listening," he said. "You have kept her," the matriarch said, inclining her head toward Ember. "And she has kept you. In our way, that bond is unnatural. In yours, perhaps it is not." Kale's jaw tightened. "You're here to take her back." "No," the matriarch said. "I am here to offer something else. The roost has no word for this bond you share, but it has strength. Dragons fight beside kin. Perhaps humans can be kin too." Ember tilted her head. "You would make a pact." The matriarch's gaze swept over the gathered villagers. "A pact between fire and forge. Dragons will guard the valley's skies. Humans will guard our young when storms or sickness threaten them. In return, neither will strike the other." The silence that followed was heavy. Kale knew such an agreement could change generations of mistrust. But it would also mean the village taking responsibility for creatures they had once feared, creatures that could kill them in a heartbeat. "What happens," Kale asked, "if a hatchling chooses a human again?" The matriarch looked directly at Ember. "Then we will not call it folly." The pact was sealed that same day. It wasn't a grand ceremony, just Kale, Ember, the matriarch, and the village elder marking the agreement in words, not in gold. When the matriarch took off, she left behind something unexpected, a small satchel of gold coins. "For the forge," she said simply. "Every pact needs a beginning." Spring came slowly to the valley. Meltwater carved silver paths down the mountains, and the air carried the scent of pine again. Kale worked the forge with Ember nearby, her tail lazily curling around the doorframe. One evening, as the sun bled orange over the peaks, Kale set down his hammer and leaned against the door. "You could have had gold," he said quietly. "You could have had power. You could have been with your own kind." Ember stretched her wings, the light catching on her scales. "I have gold," she said, glancing at the pouch in the corner. "I have fire." Her molten eyes met his. "And I have my kind." Kale's chest tightened, and he realized she was right. Treasure wasn't just what filled a chest, it was what filled the space between two beings who had no reason to trust each other, and did anyway. Years later, travelers passing through the valley would speak of a strange sight, a smith with a dragon at his side, working in perfect rhythm. Some called her his guardian. Some called him her companion. But those who stayed long enough learned the truth. There was no his or her in the way they spoke of each other. There was only ours.